The night is bitterly cold, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but seeps into your bones, slowing your thoughts, tightening your muscles. It is the early hours of February 14, 1944, and somewhere deep inside occupied France, 3 men lie motionless in frozen mud, their bodies pressed flat against the earth as if trying to disappear into it. Ahead of them stands a railway bridge, a dark silhouette cutting across a silent river. They know its name, but they have been trained not to write such things down, not to carry anything that could betray them if captured. So the river remains nameless, just another quiet witness to what is about to happen. The water below moves slowly, almost unnaturally calm, reflecting no light, making no sound. It feels as though the entire world has paused, holding its breath. One of the men shifts slightly, careful not to make even the smallest noise. Slung across his shoulder is a worn canvas satchel. Inside it lies something deceptively simple, something that does not look like a weapon of war, yet will soon unleash destruction more precise than any bomb dropped from the sky. The device inside the bag is roughly the size of a thermos flask. Its exterior is made of smooth steel, cold to the touch, solid, unremarkable. But inside, it holds a carefully engineered mechanism, packed with a substance that feels almost wax-like, paired with a timing system so intricate and expensive that each unit costs more than what a skilled worker earns in weeks. And yet, the man carrying it has not been told to admire it, or even to fully understand it. His orders are simple: place it and leave. What happens next is no longer his concern. It will be handled by physics, chemistry, and inevitability. This moment, quiet and unseen, is not unique. Over the coming months, this exact scene will repeat itself again and again across occupied Europe. Bridges will remain standing, untouched to the eye. Tracks will look perfectly normal. There will be no smoke, no warning, no visible damage. And yet, without explanation, trains will begin to fall from the world, plunging into rivers, collapsing into twisted wreckage, dragging with them cargo that Germany desperately needs to survive the war. Weapons, ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, gone in an instant. And the strangest part, no one will see it coming. This weapon will never appear on propaganda posters. It will not have a dramatic codename remembered in history books. It will not inspire headlines or heroic stories in newspapers. But quietly, almost invisibly, it will achieve something that massive bombing campaigns, costing hundreds of aircraft and countless lives, often fail to do. It will stop the German war machine, with terrifying precision. The device responsible is known simply as the fog signal. Among specialists it is called a pressure switch. And in its most refined and deadly form, it is known as switch number 10. Unlike traditional explosives designed to destroy bridges instantly, this device follows a far more sinister idea. It does not aim to break the bridge outright. Instead, it waits. It allows the bridge to remain intact, undetected, perfectly usable, until the exact moment it matters most. It waits until the enemy trusts it. Then it destroys everything. To understand why such a weapon was needed, you have to look at the bigger picture, the problem that had been frustrating Allied planners since the very beginning of the war. Nazi-occupied Europe was connected by an enormous railway network. Tracks stretched across countries like veins across a body, forming the lifeline of the German military. Everything depended on them. Troops moved by rail. Tanks were transported in parts across flatbed wagons. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. All of it flowed through this system. If you could cut those railways, you wouldn't just slow the enemy. You would cripple them. The idea was simple. The execution was anything but. Allied bombing campaigns had already tried to destroy these railways. Planes flew dangerous missions over enemy territory, dropping bombs on bridges and tracks. But the results were frustratingly poor. Railway bridges, despite their importance, were surprisingly difficult targets. From high altitude, they appeared as thin lines, hard to hit even with the best equipment available at the time. Studies later revealed a shocking truth. It often took more than 200 bombs just to successfully destroy a single bridge. And every failed attempt came at a cost. fuel, time, and most importantly, human lives. Aircraft were shot down. Crews were lost. And even when a bridge was destroyed, German engineers would arrive within days, repairing the damage with incredible efficiency, restoring the line before it could have a lasting impact. Bombing alone was not enough. So attention turned to sabotage on the ground. Resistance fighters and special operations agents could reach places aircraft couldn't. They could get close, plant explosives, and strike with precision. But this method came with its own deadly risks. Bridges were heavily guarded. Patrols moved regularly. Informants were everywhere. And the consequences of being caught were immediate and brutal. Execution for the agent. And often collective punishment for nearby civilians. Worse still, placing traditional explosives required time. Time to set charges, time to wire detonators, time that increased the chances of being discovered. What was needed was something faster, something simpler, something that could be placed in seconds and left behind without a trace. And most importantly, something that did not rely on guessing when the next train would arrive. Because guessing wrong meant failure. The solution had to be smarter. It had to remove uncertainty completely. Instead of trying to predict the train, why not let the train trigger the explosion itself? That idea, simple, almost obvious in hindsight, would change everything. And it was inside a quiet, unassuming location in England that this idea began to take shape. A place that looked nothing like a weapons lab, and yet would produce some of the most ingenious tools of sabotage ever created. Country house. Hidden workshop. A place where scientists, engineers, and unconventional thinkers were given a single mission. Find a way to turn the enemy's own strength against him. And what they created would do exactly that. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with silence, patience, and perfect timing. And what they created would do exactly that. Hidden away in the English countryside, in a requisitioned country house near Welwyn Garden City, a secret facility known as Station 9 became the birthplace of one of the most quietly devastating weapons of the war. On the outside it looked ordinary, almost peaceful. But inside it was something entirely different. It was a place where imagination was weaponized, where engineers and scientists were encouraged not just to think outside the box, but to completely ignore that the box ever existed. This was not a traditional military lab. It operated somewhere between an academic workshop and a theatrical prop department, except everything created here had to be lethal, compact, and simple enough for someone with minimal technical training to use under extreme pressure. The people who would carry these devices were not engineers. They were agents, resistance fighters, saboteurs working behind enemy lines, often alone. Leading much of this effort was physicist Stuart McCrae, along with a team of unconventional thinkers. Men who understood that winning the war would require more than brute force. It would require ingenuity. The challenge placed before them was deceptively simple to describe, but incredibly complex to solve. How do you design a device that can be attached to a railway bridge or track, and only detonate when a train is actually crossing it? A standard time delay fuse wouldn't work. An agent planting the device could never be sure when the next train would arrive. It might come in minutes, or hours. Too early, and the explosion would achieve nothing. Too late, and the device could be discovered. Tripwires were also ineffective. Railway patrols regularly inspected bridges, and any visible trigger mechanism would be quickly spotted and removed. What they needed was something invisible. Something that would wait silently, undetected, until the exact moment of maximum impact. The answer came from a simple but brilliant concept. Pressure. Not just any pressure, but a very specific kind. The kind created only by the immense weight of a fully loaded train moving at speed. From that idea, switch number 10 was born. At first glance, the device was unremarkable. A small steel cylinder about 15 centimeters long and only a few centimeters wide. Small enough to fit inside a coat pocket, or hidden at the bottom of a bag. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a piece of equipment. Ordinary, forgettable. But inside, it contained a mechanism of precise engineering. At its core was a carefully calibrated lead pellet. Positioned between a spring-loaded firing pin and its striker, this small piece of metal held everything in balance. Under normal conditions, it was strong enough to keep the firing pin locked in place. No movement, no reaction. But that stability was an illusion. Because when subjected to enough pressure, specifically the crushing force of a passing train, that lead pellet would begin to deform. And once it did, everything changed. A fully loaded freight train could exert enormous force on a bridge. Each axle alone could apply more than 100 tons of pressure as it rolled across the structure. That weight, transferred through steel and into the bridge's load-bearing elements, would compress the device. The lead pellet would collapse inward. The firing pin would be released. The detonator would ignite. And in that fraction of a second, the explosive charge attached nearby would detonate with devastating effect. But what made this device truly remarkable was not just that it worked. It was how selectively it worked. Person walking across the bridge. Nothing. A vehicle passing nearby. Nothing. Even vibrations from distant movement were not enough. Only the exact combination of mass and momentum created by a moving train, precisely the target they wanted, could trigger the mechanism. It was a weapon that could not be fooled. Agents were trained to place the switch carefully against critical structural points, typically along the main support girders or beneath the rails where the weight of the train would be most concentrated. Alongside it, they would attach the main explosive charge, often made from specially developed plastic explosives created at the same facility. The entire system weighed less than 2 kilograms. And with proper training it could be deployed in under 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That was all it took to set a trap capable of destroying an entire train. Manufacturing these devices required a different kind of secrecy. No single factory knew what it was producing. Components were divided. Springs made in one place, steel casings in another, internal parts somewhere else entirely. Only when all the pieces were brought together in secure locations did the final device take shape. This compartmentalization ensured that even if information leaked, it would reveal nothing useful. By the time the devices were fully operational, thousands had been produced. Though exact numbers remain uncertain, estimates suggest that between 8,000 and 15,000 units were distributed between 1943 and 1945. They were sent across Europe, to France, the Low Countries, northern Italy, and Yugoslavia, quietly delivered into the hands of resistance fighters who would use them with deadly efficiency. And then, slowly at first, the results began to appear. Not in dramatic explosions visible from miles away, but in something far more unsettling. Trains began to disappear. Bridges that had been inspected and declared safe suddenly collapsed at the exact moment a locomotive crossed them. Entire convoys of supplies vanished into rivers. Reinforcements that were expected never arrived. At first, German engineers struggled to understand what was happening. Reports described structural failures, bridges giving way under load, wartime stress perhaps, overuse, weak materials. But as the incidents increased, a pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not accidents. They were precise, repeated, intentional. And worst of all, they were unpredictable. Because there was nothing to see. No wires. No visible explosives. No warning signs. Just a bridge waiting. And a train that would unknowingly trigger its own destruction. For the men operating those trains, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Driving a locomotive had always been dangerous in wartime. Air attacks, sabotage, mechanical failures. These were understood risks. But this was different. This was invisible. Now every bridge became a question mark. Every crossing carried doubt. Some train drivers began slowing down in known resistance areas, despite strict orders to maintain schedules. Others took it further, stopping their trains completely, stepping out, and walking across the bridge themselves before allowing the locomotive to follow. They were searching for something. Anything. But there was nothing to find. Because the device they feared could not be triggered by a man walking. It was designed for something far heavier. Their caution, while understandable, achieved nothing except delays. And those delays, were victories in themselves. Because the goal was never just destruction. It was disruption, confusion, fear. A breakdown not just of infrastructure but of confidence. And that is exactly what this weapon delivered. Not with overwhelming force, but with quiet, relentless precision. A system designed to make the enemy doubt every movement, question every decision, and hesitate at the exact moment when speed mattered most. And in war, hesitation can be just as deadly as any explosion. And in war, hesitation can be just as deadly as any explosion. Because once doubt enters a system built on precision and timing, everything begins to slow down. Orders that once moved like clockwork now face delays. Decisions that once took seconds now take minutes. And in a conflict where momentum can decide entire campaigns, even the smallest hesitation can ripple outward into something far greater. This is exactly what began to happen across the German railway network. Trains no longer moved with the same confidence. Schedules, once rigid and strictly enforced, started to slip. A delay at one bridge meant a delay across an entire line. Supplies that were meant to arrive at dawn reached their destination at midday, or not at all. Reinforcements that were supposed to support frontline units arrived too late to matter. And all of this came from a device no larger than a thermos flask. What made the situation even more complicated for the Germans was that they were not unfamiliar with sabotage. In fact, they had developed their own range of pressure-operated devices during the war. Their engineers understood the principles involved. They knew that weight could be used as a trigger, that mechanical force could release a firing mechanism. One such German device, known as the Drachsunder, operated on a broadly similar concept. It used pressure to activate a firing pin and was often employed as a booby trap in buildings or equipment. But it lacked something crucial: the precision calibration required for railway sabotage. It wasn't designed specifically for trains. And that difference mattered. The British switch number 10 had been engineered with a singular purpose in mind. It wasn't just a pressure device. It was a perfectly tuned instrument, calibrated to respond only to the immense and specific forces generated by a moving locomotive. That level of refinement made it uniquely effective in its role. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American engineers working under the Office of Strategic Services were developing their own versions of similar devices. Collaborating closely with their British counterparts, they shared research, ideas, and manufacturing techniques. The American version, often referred to as the T7 pressure igniter, followed the same fundamental principle but used a slightly different internal design: a lead collar instead of a pellet. It was marginally heavier, slightly different in construction, but in practice it achieved the same result. By 1944, these designs had evolved to the point where they were nearly interchangeable in the field. The principle had proven itself. Pressure-based triggering was not just effective, it was superior. But what truly set the British approach apart was not just the device itself. It was everything built around it. Station 9 did not simply create a tool and send it out into the world. They understood that even the most brilliant invention is useless if it is not used correctly. So alongside the device, they developed something equally important: doctrine. Detailed training manuals were written, explaining exactly how and where to place the device for maximum effectiveness. These weren't vague instructions. They were precise, methodical, based on real engineering principles. Different types of bridges required different placement techniques. A steel girder bridge behaved differently under load compared to a stone arch structure. The way force traveled through the materials changed the optimal placement point for the device. And agents needed to understand this. Training programs were established in remote locations across Britain, particularly in the Scottish Highlands and the New Forest. Here recruits, many of whom had never handled explosives before, were taught how to deploy these devices with confidence and precision. They practiced with dummy versions, identical in weight and shape but completely safe to handle. They learned how to approach a target, how to move unseen, how to work quickly under pressure. Every detail mattered. Because in the field there would be no second chances. By the time these agents were deployed into occupied territory, they were not just carrying a device. They were carrying knowledge. Knowledge that turned a small piece of equipment into a strategic weapon. And the timing of its widespread use could not have been more critical. By mid-1944, the Allies were preparing for one of the most significant operations of the war, the invasion of Normandy. Success depended not just on landing troops on the beaches, but on preventing German forces from responding quickly enough to push them back into the sea. Speed was everything. If German armored divisions could reach the beaches in time, the invasion might fail. So the railways had to be disrupted. This led to a coordinated sabotage effort known as Plan Tortue, a widespread campaign aimed at crippling the French railway network in the weeks surrounding the D-Day landings. Resistance groups, working closely with special operations advisors, launched attacks across the country. Bridges were targeted. Tracks were sabotaged. Supply lines were cut. And among these efforts, the pressure switch devices played a significant role. In regions like Calvados, where fighting would soon become intense, resistance fighters carried out dozens of successful bridge attacks in the weeks following June 6, 1944. Some used traditional explosives, requiring careful planning and timing. But many relied on the silent efficiency of pressure-operated switches. These devices required no presence at the moment of detonation. Once placed, the agent could leave immediately, reducing the risk of capture and allowing operations to continue elsewhere. German railway reports from this period began to describe a disturbing trend. Bridges were collapsing not randomly, but at the exact moment trains were crossing them. At first, engineers attributed this to structural fatigue, bridges weakened by constant use under wartime conditions. But as the pattern repeated, as more and more incidents occurred under identical circumstances, the explanation became harder to sustain. This was not coincidence. It was design. And once that realization set in, it introduced something far more damaging than physical destruction. It introduced uncertainty. Because now every bridge was suspect. Every crossing was a risk. Every train journey carried the possibility that somewhere beneath the wheels, hidden against the steel, a small unseen device was waiting. Waiting not for a specific time, but for them. The psychological toll deepened. Railway crews, already under pressure to maintain schedules, now faced an invisible threat that could not be predicted or easily countered. Slowing down didn't help. Inspecting bridges didn't guarantee safety. The device was too well concealed, too precisely calibrated. And that meant one thing. There was no reliable defense. In response, German command issued strict orders to maintain movement, to avoid unnecessary delays. But orders cannot erase fear. And fear, once it takes hold, changes behavior in subtle but significant ways. Trains slowed. Inspections increased. Time was lost. And with every delay, the Allied strategy gained ground. Because this was never just about destroying bridges. It was about disrupting a system so thoroughly that it could no longer function as intended. A system built on speed, now forced into hesitation. A network designed for efficiency, now tangled in uncertainty. And all of it traced back to a simple idea, executed with precision, and deployed at exactly the right moment in history. And all of it traced back to a simple idea, executed with precision, and deployed at exactly the right moment in history. Because by the summer of 1944, the war had reached a point where small advantages could create massive consequences. The Allied forces had landed in Normandy, but holding that fragile foothold was far from guaranteed. The beachhead was vulnerable, exposed, and dangerously dependent on time. Every hour mattered. Every delay imposed on German reinforcements increased the chances of survival. And this is where the true impact of the pressure-operated sabotage devices began to reveal itself. Post-war analysis would later attempt to measure just how effective the railway disruption had been. Economists, military historians, and strategic analysts all tried to untangle the web of cause and effect. It was never a simple calculation. Air raids, fuel shortages, partisan attacks, and Allied air superiority over roads all played their roles. But within that complex picture, one fact stood out. German reinforcements did not arrive when they were supposed to. In some cases, delays ranged from 3 to 7 days, an eternity in active combat conditions. Units that were meant to counterattack immediately were forced into long, fragmented journeys, often arriving exhausted, disorganized, and too late to make a decisive difference. One of the most well-known examples is the movement of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Stationed in southern France, this powerful armored division was ordered to move north toward Normandy as quickly as possible following the Allied landings. Under normal conditions, the journey should have taken only a few days. But nothing about the situation was normal anymore. Railway disruptions forced the division to abandon large portions of its planned route. Trains could not move freely. Bridges were unreliable. Tracks were damaged or under constant threat. As a result, much of the journey had to be completed by road. And roads, unlike railways, were slower, more exposed, and far less efficient for moving heavy armored units. What should have been a 3-day redeployment stretched into 17 days. 17 days in which the Allied forces were able to strengthen their position, bring in reinforcements, and prepare defenses that would have been far weaker had the German response been immediate. Now, it is important to be precise here. The delay of Das Reich cannot be attributed to a single cause. It was the result of multiple factors: fuel shortages, resistance attacks, airstrikes, and the overall strain on German logistics. But within that mix, railway sabotage played a critical role. And within that sabotage effort, devices like Switch Number 10 were key contributors. They did not act alone, but they amplified everything else. They turned minor disruptions into major obstacles. They forced detours, created uncertainty, and slowed movement at exactly the moments when speed was most critical. And perhaps most importantly, they did so efficiently. Compared to large-scale bombing operations, the pressure switch devices were remarkably cost-effective. They required no aircraft, no large crews, no massive logistical support. A single agent, working quickly and quietly, could achieve results that would otherwise require dozens of sorties. They were lighter, cheaper, safer to deploy, and far more precise in their impact. This combination made them one of the most effective tools of sabotage available during the war. Even so, historians have been careful not to overstate their role. The collapse of German logistics in France during the summer of 1944 was the result of many overlapping pressures. Air superiority allowed Allied aircraft to attack road convoys with near impunity. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Strategic overextension stretched German resources thin across multiple fronts. All of these factors mattered. But what the pressure-operated devices represent is something slightly different. They represent a qualitative shift, a change not just in scale but in method. Before their introduction, sabotage often relied on direct destruction, blowing up a bridge, tearing apart a track, creating visible damage that would then be repaired. It was effective but temporary. Given enough time, the system would recover. What Switch Number 10 introduced was a new kind of disruption. Invisible, delayed, and perfectly timed. Instead of destroying infrastructure immediately, it allowed that infrastructure to function until the exact moment it was under maximum strain. This meant that damage occurred when it was hardest to repair, when it caused the most chaos, and when it had the greatest operational impact. A bridge collapsing under no load is an inconvenience. A bridge collapsing under a fully loaded train is a catastrophe. And that distinction changed everything. After the war, surviving examples of these devices began to appear in museums and collections. Places like the Imperial War Museum in London now hold specimens of the switch, preserved behind glass. Nearby, other institutions maintain collections of SOE equipment. Small, unassuming objects that once played a role in shaping the course of history. Looking at them today, they don't appear particularly impressive. There are no dramatic features, no visible complexity. Just a small steel cylinder, simple in appearance. But that simplicity is deceptive. Because inside that cylinder lies an idea that transformed the way sabotage could be carried out. An idea that proved you didn't need massive force to create massive impact. You just needed to apply it at the right moment. And perhaps nowhere is that idea more clearly illustrated than in the final image we return to. A frozen riverbank. February 1944. The man with the satchel is already gone. He moves quietly through the darkness, retracing his steps, leaving behind no trace of his presence. The bag he carries is now empty. His task is complete. Behind him, the bridge stands unchanged. There are no signs of damage. No indication that anything has been altered. To anyone passing by, a patrol, an inspector, a railway worker, it appears perfectly normal. Operational. Exactly as it should be. And somewhere far away, in a warm office, a German officer studies reports, confident that the network remains intact. The schedules are set. Trains will run. Everything is under control. But beneath that calm surface, something has already been set in motion. Something silent. Something patient. Waiting not for a specific time, but for the precise moment when it will matter most. Waiting not for a specific time, but for the precise moment when it will matter most. And that moment will come without warning. The train will depart exactly as scheduled. Its engine will roar to life in the early hours of the morning, steam and smoke rising into the cold air as metal wheels begin their steady rhythm along the tracks. Inside its wagons, there will be everything the German war machine depends on. Crates of ammunition, fuel reserves, spare parts, perhaps even troops heading toward a front line where every second counts. To those on board, this is just another journey. Another mission. Another routine movement through a system that, until recently, had functioned with near-perfect reliability. The tracks ahead appear clear. The bridge stands firm in the distance. There is no reason to suspect anything. No reason to slow down. And so the locomotive continues forward, gathering speed, its weight pressing harder and harder into the rails with every passing second. Steel meets steel. Force transfers downward through the wheels into the structure beneath. And then, it happens. Not with a warning. Not with a visible trigger. But in a fraction of a second so small it cannot be perceived. Deep within the structure of the bridge, hidden against a load-bearing beam, a small steel cylinder feels the full force of the train above it. Inside that cylinder, the lead pellet, the quiet guardian holding everything in place, begins to give way. Compresses. Deforms. Collapses inward under the immense pressure. And in that instant the balance is broken. The firing pin is released. The detonator ignites. The explosion that follows is not random. It is not uncontrolled. It is precise. Focused exactly where it will cause the most damage. The structural element bearing the weight of the train is shattered at the exact moment it is under maximum stress. The bridge does not simply break. Fails. Catastrophically. The section beneath the locomotive gives way first, unable to support the immense load now pressing down upon it. The train, still moving forward, has no time to react. Momentum carries it into the void as steel twists, snaps, and collapses beneath it. In seconds everything is over. The locomotive plunges downward, dragging its wagons behind it. Cargo spills into the river below. Equipment, weapons, men, all lost in a chaotic cascade of destruction. What was moments ago a functioning part of a vast logistical network is now a shattered ruin. And the most devastating part, it happened at the worst possible moment. Not when the bridge was empty. Not when it could be easily repaired. But when it was carrying exactly what the enemy needed most. This is what made the weapon so effective. Didn't just destroy infrastructure. It destroyed opportunity. It ensured that the loss was not just physical, but strategic. Supplies that were meant to reinforce a front line would never arrive. Troops that were needed in battle would be lost before they could even engage. Plans built around timing and coordination would begin to unravel. All because of a device that had been placed in minutes, and then left behind. And this is where the true brilliance of the concept reveals itself. Because the power of the weapon was never just in the explosive it carried. It was in the idea behind it. The realization that the most powerful force available to a saboteur is not the energy of the explosion, but the energy of the enemy's own system turned against itself. The Germans relied on their railways. The railways relied on their bridges. And those bridges, once fitted with a simple hidden device, became the very instruments of destruction. It was a reversal of logic, a transformation of strength into vulnerability. Instead of attacking the system from the outside, it allowed the system to collapse from within. And perhaps that is why it remains such a remarkable example of wartime innovation. Because it did not rely on overwhelming force. It relied on understanding. Understanding how structures behave under load. Understanding how systems depend on timing and trust. And most importantly, understanding that sometimes the most effective way to break something is to let it function normally until the exact moment it cannot. The men who carried these devices rarely saw the results of their actions. They placed the switch, attached the charge, and disappeared into the night. By the time the explosion occurred, they were miles away, already moving on to the next mission. There were no dramatic confirmations, no immediate feedback, just the quiet knowledge that somewhere at some point the device would do its work. And it always did. Today, when we look back at the tools and technologies of the Second World War, it is easy to focus on the largest, most visible machines, tanks, aircraft, massive artillery pieces. These dominate the images we associate with a conflict. But hidden behind those images are smaller innovations, quieter ideas, tools that didn't roar or blaze across the sky, but instead operated in silence, shaping events in ways that were no less significant. Switch number 10 was one of those tools. It did not win the war on its own. No single weapon ever does. But it changed the way sabotage could be carried out. It introduced a level of precision and efficiency that had not existed before. It proved that intelligence and creativity could rival brute force. And in doing so, it left a legacy far greater than its size would suggest. Because in the end, it all comes back to that simple image. 3 men lying in frozen mud. Canvas satchel. A bridge in the darkness. No noise. No movement. No sign that anything is about to change. And yet, everything has already been decided. The device is in place. The mechanism is set. The outcome is inevitable. Somewhere down the line, a train will approach. It will cross the bridge. And in that single, perfectly timed moment, the mathematics will complete themselves. The weight will press down. The lead will give way. The firing pin will strike. And history, quietly and precisely, will shift. All from an idea so simple it almost feels invisible. An idea that turned an entire system against itself. An idea carried in a small satchel, by a man who never stayed to watch it happen. And that, in the end, was enough.